There's no connection between Mr. Kohberger and the victims. There is no explanation for the total lack of DNA evidence from the victims in Mr. Kohberger's apartment, in his office, in his home, or his vehicle.
I mean, to be honest, you're going to have to trust us on that at this point, because we're not going to release why we think that.
All right. Like to tell you I'm happy to be here, but why start with an untruth? I am accepting of my responsibility to be here. I want to go over with you some expectations of mine.
A circumstantial case requires an airtight, rock-solid story. But this is the biggest hurdle in the state's case versus Bryan Kohberger. So welcome to the point. Let's get to it.
Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Everything said here is alleged. Please do your own research and form your own opinion, and let me know that opinion, because this is an open discussion channel. And I try to be fair here, so if more fair coverage and an open conversation is something you prefer, subscribe to this channel and hit that like button down below. Because we all want justice for the Idaho 4. If Bryan did it, and he should pay. But it has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt is the biggest hurdle in the state's case against Bryan Kohberger, based off what's available to me. If you disagree, please feel free to let me know down below, but here's why. Let's keep something in mind here, and that's the timeline. Now, I understand all these video cameras aren't synced to the exact same time, but what's an acceptable error here that's reasonable? Even if you shift one camera to the left and the other camera to the right, that is still a very crazy tight window for all this to go down. And while everybody is allegedly in their room asleep, someone's playing with Murphy in the upstairs bedroom while Bryan Kohberger is still driving his car. So is it reasonable to think that one person in under 10 minutes plus or minus parked the car, then went into a home loaded with cars out front to attack one person but fought 3 others who didn't make a peep during that struggle, while leaving one eyewitness alive who didn't call 911? And that's not even the biggest hurdle here, but make that make sense. Because the possibility that this happened isn't in question here. We know it's possible for this to happen because it did happen in this particular story, according to law enforcement. It's the probability that all this happened with one person, and that's what's going to be questioned at trial. And I'll be honest with you, that probability must be less than 1 in 5.37 octillion, right? But the reasonable doubt gets higher when you talk about the elephant in the room that the mainstream media seems to want to ignore.
That there are 3 other unknown male DNA profiles that were found at the scene of the murders. 2 were inside the house, and 1 was outside of the house on King Road on a glove.
And let's be honest, in any other scenario, this would still be a talking point that's up for debate. And keep this one thing in mind while we talk about this. Rachel Morin's body was discovered outside in the elements. That means her body was exposed to wind, moisture, dirt, debris, insects, and everything in between. And it was a tiny hair that led investigators to find a suspect. So explain the lack of DNA to me.
I mean, to be honest, you're going to have to trust us on that at this point.
More importantly, the lack of pursuit to identify that unidentified male DNA found inside and outside the home. Look, court records indicate that law enforcement investigated various suspects, many of whom provided DNA samples, which would then mean that some didn't. So who were these individuals police thought were a potential suspect that didn't provide a DNA sample? And why didn't they provide a DNA sample? I'm not trying to have a tinfoil hat here, but any unbiased juror will be asking themselves that question at trial when this comes up. And this question alone provides mountains of reasonable doubt here in this story, to anyone who's willing to admit that law enforcement isn't always perfect. Think about that for a second. Law enforcement found skin cells on a sheath that goes to a weapon that doesn't necessarily match all the wounds inflicted on these 4 victims, as described by Kathy Mabbitt, and they moved mountains and bridges to figure out who that DNA belonged to. But on the other side of that argument, we have possible suspects that refuse to give a DNA sample to law enforcement, and we have unidentified male DNA found in the home and 1 found outside. And for some reason, law enforcement says, fine, we're not going to pursue that anymore.
But when you're dealing with a crime of this magnitude, then you do want to test all the testable DNA at the crime scene. So this is going to be big.
and a reasonable person is just supposed to say okay? It's not going to be any of these people that are statistically more likely to cause this crime because they know at least one or all of the victims. It's this guy over here who has no ties to the home or no ties to the victims, where they found no hair, no bodily fluid, no fingerprints, just skin cells. Which you can pick your study at this point to see how science says you can leave skin cells on objects while never having touched those objects. It isn't a mystery, it isn't a conspiracy, it is something that has been widely proven for the longest time. Which is why in most cases skin cells found at a home are not considered to be the end-all be-all. And I understand that there's a side of this argument where law enforcement believes they have their guy. And they said there's no reason for us to pursue this particular part of the argument. But the prosecution doesn't have to prove to law enforcement beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of his peers, which means people like you and me. The idea law enforcement got this wrong, or their case is weak, is very scary. And that fear has a lot of y'all afraid to think. We've seen no footage as of now showing him driving his car, getting out of his car, and going into that home. Law enforcement identified a car that wasn't even his. And I don't feel like I'm wearing a tinfoil hat in this particular conversation. I feel like these are real legitimate questions that a lot of people are afraid to ask. And quite frankly, I think they're afraid to ask these questions because they're worried about losing subscribers. Especially when you consider the true crime community is made up of mostly people who believe you are guilty until you're proven innocent. Which is not what we do on this channel. We're not scared to ask the questions a potential juror may have. We're not scared to have expectations from law enforcement. It's not the possibility this stuff went down, it's the probability of how it went down that is in question here. And one of the most comments I receive when I make videos on this subject is individuals make the statement, we are just looking at one particular piece of the evidence. When you look at everything in its totality, who else could it be but Bryan Kohberger? Which is fine because this is an open discussion channel at the end of the day. But the concern a lot of people should have when you're looking at this thing from the overall scope of everything that is in the court records is so much of this is able to be picked apart. So while each individual video may be on one particular subject here, like the car or the security camera footage, the DNA evidence found on the sheath or the type of weapon used for the crime, when you put all that together, does that not dismantle a lot of what the state is trying to say they have against Bryan Kohberger? I mean, if I'm wrong, but that's just how I'm seeing things. It's the inconsistencies that should concern a whole lot of people. There should be more there. There should have been way more physical evidence at the scene, or in his car, or his apartment. I mean, maybe this was the perfect storm of coincidences. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you'll let me know down in the comments below. Y'all be safe now.